just a bit of housekeeping before we start the event. For the people who are here in the room, there are toilets out here and in the corner. It is raining, so if it's a bit too rainy for you, please feel free to use the inside ones up the stairs behind the counter. Also, the rules at the moment, which change every 5 seconds about the mask wearing, is that at the moment we can drink sitting down without masks, but as soon as you finish drinking, put the mask back on. So that's great. And also at all times in the shop, masks to be worn. We're very, very lucky that this is squeezed in, I think, before we've had to do any more adjustments of our events. Fingers crossed they'll get it under control and we continue our program uninterrupted, but at the moment we're just touching wood and very lucky that we're here in real life with such a lovely group tonight. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight, the Yagara and Turrbal people in this area, and pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and of course to any other Aboriginal people who are here tonight. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. I would also like to say that because our Zoom audience is there on lots of different places around Australia, we're zooming out onto the lands of different Aboriginal peoples around Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders on the land that you are meeting on as well. So tonight it is my great pleasure just to introduce Dr. Ella Jeffrey, who is an award-winning poet and editor. Her debut collection of poetry, Deadbolt, was published in June 2020 and won the inaugural Puncher and Watman Prize for her first book of poems and the Anne Elder Award. She's a recipient of the 2019 Queensland Premiers and Young Publishers and Writers Award, and her poems, essays and criticism appear in journals and anthologies, including Meanjin, Southerly Island, Westerly, Best Australian Poems, and many others. Ella co-edits still? Yeah, great. A triennial digital poetry journal and is poetry editor of the Australian academic journal Social Alternatives. She holds a PhD from Queensland University of Technology and lives in Brisbane. Everybody welcome Dr. Ella Jeffrey. And again, we're really, really glad that Heather Taylor-Johnson could actually travel across a border to be with us today, one of the only borders that she could possibly cross in Australia. And I will leave Ella to welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you so, oh, there we go. Thank you so much, Chrissy, for that lovely introduction. And yes, welcome, Heather. It's an absolute thrill to have you here in real life. You know, I think for a little while we weren't sure whether we would be here in real life today. So it's really, really exciting for us to be able to have this conversation about Rhymes with Hyenas in person. I'm really thrilled to be here to talk to you. I'm going to start by introducing Heather and reading her luminous bio, and then we're going to have a bit of a question and answer, talk a little bit about Rhymes with Hyenas and the different kinds of things that you were doing with this book, and then a little later on there's an opportunity to ask questions. So if anybody has any questions that you would like to ask about this book, it's really rich. There's so much going on, so many different characters that I think many of you will know and be familiar with in your own ways. So I think you might have questions about some of them, as I do. Please hold them and we will get to them towards the end. Similarly, if you're joining us on Zoom and you have questions, you can put them through in the chat. Is that right, Chrissy? Is that okay?
Yes, they can.
Yes, please pop them through in the chat. And similarly, if you are feeling like you would like to buy a copy of Rhymes with Hyenas, which I strongly recommend that you do, you can purchase one here in store, and I think you might also put a link for that in the chat as well. Lovely. Okay, so I am going to introduce Heather, who is an American-Australian writer living on Kaurna land in Adelaide. Rhymes with Hyenas is her 5th complete work of published poetry, though her first verse novel and her first hybrid work. She is also the editor of Shaping the Fractured Self, Poetry of Chronic Illness and Pain. Her second novel, Jean Harley Was Here, shortlisted for the Readings Prize for New Fiction, discussed on ABC's Book Club with Jennifer Byrne, and reviewed in the New York Times, has been optioned for a 7-part TV series, which she will co-write. In 2018, Heather was writer in residence at the J M Coetzee Centre for Creative Practice at the University of Adelaide, where she is now an Adjunct Research Fellow. Welcome, Heather. It's fantastic to get to talk to you tonight. Yes, give Heather a round of applause. Look, I absolutely loved reading Runs with Hyenas. It's such an inventive hybrid work. It's an epistolary verse novel. We meet 6 women from various kind of canonical works of fiction whose stories have kind of been positioned in front of us by men. And I wondered, first of all, if you could tell us a little bit about where the germ of this idea came from. It's such an unusual and inventive concept. What made you want to write this particular novel?
Well, in 2010, there was a D.H. Lawrence conference in Sydney. I really wanted to go. So I thought, what can I do to get to that conference? So I thought, I love Women in Love. I really thought that was a great book, but there were so many problems in it with the way that the women were treated. I thought, well, I'll just get the Brangwyn sisters to communicate with each other. I didn't think of any of the other women until the conference was over. And then I started coming up with a few different women, and I had to get rid of some of the women as time went. I had a Ellen Jamesian from World According to Garb.
Oh, wow.
Which is just one of my favorite books.
Mine as well.
I thought, just the trauma, I can't. I had Medea, and I thought, I just can't. I just can't imagine. So I had to let some women go. But the other women, they were there basically all at one go. I started thinking, I think I know who I want to do. And
yeah. Well, maybe I should let everybody in and remind you all of who you will encounter in this book. So we have Lilith from Hebrew mythology to start with. We have Katerina from The Taming of the Shrew. And that to me is one of the most kind of complex and arresting characters in this book. We have Ursula from Lawrence's Women in Love. We have, I forgot her name. Is it Linda?
Mel.
Yeah, I always think of Melanie.
Yeah.
That's what the name is. Melanie from Disgrace. And we have Caddy from The Sound and the Fury, who I also really loved reading the story of. And they're all women poets in Heather's work who live and work in Adelaide and join a poetry writing group. And so they're all sharing poems with each other throughout this book and sharing emails with each other. And what we kind of see over the course of the book is their correspondence sitting alongside their poetry. And it gives us this really lovely insight into the way that they speak to each other as women, the way that they grow and develop as poets, but also the way that they grow and develop as people in and through those relationships. And I wondered, what made you want to write about writing groups? Have writing groups been integral to your writing practice? Is that something that you think is really important for women writers in particular as well?
I've always been in writing groups. In recent years, I sort of handpicked them for projects,
Okay.
So that tends to work well. But there was with poetry. Well, I guess that's with prose, but with poetry, I've been in 2 writing groups, and they both lasted for several years. And look, I wanted to ask. Once it expanded to all the different women, and I realized that we were going to live in Adelaide. Then it turned into something where I thought I can raise Adelaide a little bit here. Like I'm giving myself a little bit of an opportunity to do some call outs to some Adelaide poets, and especially I really enjoyed calling out venues where people where they would hold readings and various readings. There's a few like really old school ones in there because we don't really have readings anymore. We've got one and it's in there, and that's really all we have going on right now. So it was nice to be able to call out some older ones.
Yeah. It really feels like I think it really kind of develops the realism of the novel because it is such a strong and kind of vivid idea, but grounding it in Adelaide really makes it feel like it actually happens. And so, these women writers, they meet real life writers like Michelle Cale, and they read Libby Hart, and then they see Natalie Harkin read, and they go to the Fringe Festival or they perform at the Fringe Festival. So it all feels kind of very grounded in the here and now, which I sort of love that idea of, you know, maybe I could just meet Katarina at an event one day. You know, it kind of feels like being at a launch, much like we're at right now. And there's this kind of lovely sense of, you know, writers getting published in this writing group and encouraging each other to do so.
I had to cut a lot of women out, women poets out, because I had so many.
The real life ones, or
the real life ones.
Ah.
I just had so many, and it started to read, you know, like I was putting myself out there and saying, oh, these are the people I like. So, you know, I'm just gonna, so I got rid of probably 80% of them. Yeah.
Well, that actually brings me to the question that I wanted to ask you, which was, how did you sort of narrow it down? You know, what made you keep the ones that you kept? And I have to say that I forgot one essential woman, Dolores from Nabokov's Lolita. How could I forget her? Appears as the mother of a teenager living in Adelaide, writing these really kind of lush, intense poems, and is also an integral part of the book as well. So what made you kind of keep these particular writers?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I know there were certain poets I really did want to pay homage to. Libby Hart, I feel, needs to be celebrated a lot. And I feel that, you know, she's one of those quiet sort of poets who doesn't put herself out there a lot. So I really wanted her to be there. You know, Jill Jones was an easy one because we live in Adelaide, and, you know, people think we don't have much going on in Adelaide, and I just keep going, oh, we've got Jill Jones. What are you talking about? So had to sort of put her in. Michelle Call was an interesting one because I once told her that I really loved her commas, and she kind of laughed at that and said, my commas.
Oh, that's in the book.
And I wanted to put that in the book because I thought, but I think she does do interesting things with commas. So because I wanted the women to critique poetry, that seemed a kind of quirky thing to put in there. You know, Natalie Harkin is just doing such interesting things, and I wanted her in there. Similarly, Louise Nicholas is maybe a lesser known poet in the nation, but she has been writing for a really long time and writing really beautiful poetry. And I think she's an undersung poet in Adelaide. So that was, you know, there were a few where I just went, well, I'm going to do whatever the hell I want. So Louise was one of those, and Libby Hart was one of those.
And what about the literary women who are, you know, our kind of 6 kind of core protagonists? How did you narrow it down to those 6? You know, I imagine, as you were saying, there's a real big cast of other kind of women. And I can imagine, you know, I was thinking as I was reading this, you know, the history of books about women that aren't really for women or haven't really been written by women or in any way kind of are interested in serving ideas about what it is to be female are quite legion. So I can imagine it was really hard to narrow it down. How did you choose those 6?
I mean, each for their own different reasons. You know, Dolores, I thought, you know, she doesn't want to be called Lolita, of course, nor does Katrina want to be called Kate. I chose Dolores because I just remember the end of that book, you know, that he sort of goes a bit into the future, and he comes to her door and she's grown. And I thought, well, this is a really interesting story too. So I just wanted to carry her on. And she just felt damaged at the end of that book too. So I wanted her to thrive a little bit. And, you know, Caddy, well, it's just one of my favorite books, is The Sound of the Fury. And it quite is infuriating that her brothers are all completely screwed up because of her, and she's just existing as a sister. So, you know, I thought it was really important. The whole book is based on her. She is the main character, but she never speaks. So she was the one that really gave me the idea for the concept of giving them female voices and carrying that on. You know, Katharina, it's like, it's supposed to be a comedy, The Taming of the Shrew, and it's just, it's horrible what she goes through. So I guess I wanted to, she's the most damaged and complex character, and I guess I, needed to point that out a little bit. I mean, there's different reasons for each of them.
Every single one of them, for sure. Caddy was also one of my favorites in the book, and I wondered if perhaps you might read us a couple of Caddy poems or a couple of Caddy emails, so we can hear a little bit about her voice. And just while you're finding that, I'll tell everyone a little bit about Caddy, who in this book is living in Adelaide and working as a poet, and has a young baby, in addition to, I think, a couple of other kids as well. Her husband works quite a lot and isn't necessarily around very much, and she's, her youngest, Bruno, comes with her everywhere. And so I think in lots of ways she rattles some of the other writers in the group, because she brings along this kind of really clear and embodied experience of the domestic and the maternal that I think they sometimes find challenging. Like the baby comes to the writing group, and that's sometimes complicated as well. And I really loved that about Caddy, her kind of unapologetic sort of insistence on being a mother, and being really firmly rooted in the domestic space and seeing something kind of lush and beautiful, but at the same time challenging in that.
I probably needed you about 18 years ago. Caddy was the easiest one to write because she was very much me when my kids were little. So I just found her a joy to write, and she is a little bit joyous. I think she uses emojis and she uses explanation points and stuff. So I've always been quite insecure that I write too many dog poems and children poems, and so and I've always thought that people really were bothered by that. So it was fun to write her. So this is an email she sends. Ursula has just said, I loved your last poem. Thank you for it. And she's like, and don't listen to what Lilith said about Bruno's head. It was really rude. So Caddy says, hi, Ursula. It's sometimes embarrassing how organized I am. I just thank goodness I can laugh at myself. I'm glad you brought up Lilith. Must say I was a titty bit intimidated. I hate that we're talking behind her back, or typing, I suppose. I was trying to work out how to leave Bruno at home next time, but who would look after those fingers and that head? Jean-Guy is home on Sundays, but he says it's too difficult to have both children with him alone, especially as he can't get Bruno to take a bottle. I find juggling the domestics so hard, so thank you for your email. And Ursula, I stand by my words. I love rhymes and the indentations. Here's me sending a brava kiss your way. Those are roses at your feet. I don't do much with indentations, but I should because they're fun to read, and you placed us at the beach for goodness sake. We should at least be allowed to have some fun. Smiling emoji. Go with your gut, that womanly gut where fire sometimes pauses to reflect on itself. We are still thinking about fire, aren't we? Have they really stopped? Are they coming back? Will next year be worse? And yes, she did rhyme, of course. What lasts most for me when I think about Lilith at the meeting is not her obvious annoyance with Bruno, because he was demanding my attention a lot, and that really was annoying, but the story she told us of the women in the Amazon breastfeeding monkeys, and also the one about the 22 Swiliot women throwing their children from crags before they jumped, one by one, singing death above slavery, set our bodies free. Have a lovely Tuesday in this beautiful sun. Caddy. And then it's an example of the kind of poetry she writes. So she's, like I said, she's really really domesticated, but she's also really homesick. And I don't think many of the women are homesick in the way Caddy is. And because she was, from Mississippi, and we spent a lot of time in the South, also I enjoyed just getting back to that southern space. So this one's called Mississippi. You offer me crab apples, lightning bugs, a red pickup with a Confederate flag passing black men walking for miles, the gentle roll of a flat road leading to some other country. I wrap the warmth of my body around your great rivers, my hips and elbows curving with each bend. I let clear water from creeks splash my skin, hold white pebbles in my hand and pack them away for a time like now. I smell you, Mississippi, petals of honeysuckle wet like my own, your name a soft stammer on my tongue, like a lover's. I romanticize you as wild and random. Native honeybees flirt in the juices of a full-bosomed magnolia tree, where in its branches, the trill of a mockingbird, and over there, the sound of someone's pleasure at 3 in the afternoon. Sarsaparilla, Chickasaw, loblolly pine, dead skunk. I can hear your guitar and your fiddle, your children and your unborn babies, the old stories of mammies, of the fields, of dead brothers.
It's a really beautiful poem, really gorgeous. And, you know, it made a lot of sense when you said before that Caddy was somebody that you had connected to a lot, because I think that there's such richness in Caddy in this book, and I really gravitated towards that throughout. I feel like she is, you know, she reaches out to so many of the other women in the group in different ways, and there's, you know, one of the pleasures of this book is seeing how all of the women connect to each other. And I loved that you picked up that particular email as well, because what we get with the correspondence between the women is that they don't always agree, and they don't always necessarily feel connected to each other, which I think is a really important thing for us to kind of see in female relationships.
I have to thank Penelope Leyland, who's also a very good poet. She edited this, and she didn't really touch the poems, but she asked me a lot of questions about narrative. And I just reminded that I had to remind myself that they were all really in love with each other. So my last poetry group was called Edit When Sober, and that was with Rachel Mead and Alison Flett. And we all just loved each other, like ridiculously. And we have a beautiful friendship that carried on from it today. I don't feel that we had that sort of antagonism, but there's 6 women in this. So I think that's, you know,
More personalities to deal with.
So Penelope sort of asked me some questions, and I thought, yeah, no, they do need to have a little bit of every now and again. So, and Caddy was easy.
An easy target in some ways, yeah. And I kind of loved that, you know, it really rang true, that kind of clash of sensibilities that you sometimes feel, you know, with writers as well, because the other thing that I think is kind of a feat in this book is the way in which these are 6 writers who all have very different styles of poetry. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you know, what was your process with writing the book in terms of, you know, maybe we can talk in a moment about, you know, putting together the actual narrative progression of the book, because it is a first novel and those kind of hybrid works can be quite complex to write. But just in terms of writing the stylistic kind of differences into each of these poems, you know, I notice also that they kind of they don't always cleave to your own, you know, characteristics as a poet yourself. So how did you go about doing that?
Well, like I said, Caddy was very similar to me, so I just let her rip the way that I would. The first poetry group I was in, this is going to be funny, it was called the KPT. Some of you might remember some of the poets. Belle Shank was in it, Tim Sinclair, Lucy Alexandra. Anyway, we used to wear T-shirts, and we go to pubs together and perform poems on the same theme and stuff. We were really young, and we
kind
were
of like a
20.
performance.
Oh my God, yes. It was. It's so funny to think of now, but it was pivotal in my life at that time. You know, I was in my early 20s, and so I actually dug into my folders from way back then, and that's Dolores. So she
classic.
So because she's a spoken word artist, and I don't do spoken word at all. But I thought, oh, I kind of came close to it back then when we had our Sex with Chili shirts on. So so that's there. Catherine, you know, basically I wrote them all separately. And I was reading the book and then decided to write while I was reading the book. And, you know, Catherine was the most interesting to write for me because she's so traumatized, and she has, you know, an abusive home life with her husband, Patricio. And so I wanted her poems to be really fragmented and lots of space in between and jagged. And, you know, Lilith, she writes sonnets. So I guess that was an easy way for me to go, oh, okay, so that's something she does.
And she also has kind of a formal quality about her in general. But to go back to...
She's the first lady of the world.
She really is. She really is, and she deserves that role. To go back to Katerina, I wondered, you know, I think she's a fascinating character, probably has the most powerful narrative arc in the story, and I don't want to necessarily give any of that stuff away, but I wondered whether you might read us a Katerina poem so we can hear a little bit from her, because also what happens is that she's sort of grappling at times with you know, her story emerging into other women's poetry in the group. So they kind of write about the taming of the shrew, and there's some discussion about whether it's okay for them to write about each other's stories, which is this sort of interesting metafictional moment that maybe we'll come to after you've read that little piece there.
Yeah. Katrina's fun because she's very new to poetry, and she doesn't really quite get it. Like, she doesn't get why she's doing it, or how to make sense of it, really, but she's drawn to it. So I had fun writing her. She was sort of challenging, but at the same time really freeing, because I don't write the way she writes so much. This is an example of what she writes. This one's called Mother. If my father was king, then thistles, then knuckles, then rings and prowess. That beneath she lay in velvet robes, between her legs a rose. Simple.
Yeah, it's really arresting there, really compelling. And I love the way that she, doesn't feel compelled to put too much on the page. And she's willing to kind of use the field of the page, I think, in a way that not many of the other poets that we see in this collection are, so if you can see it, when you look at the book later, you'll be able to see the way that Katarina's poems sort of move right across to the right-hand margin. And there's a sort of, I think, discursive quality to the way that she writes that really represents some of the turmoil that she's going through. So there is a moment that I wanted to go back to in this book, which is, as I was reading it, I was kind of swept up in, this really vivid world that you'd created, where it's Adelaide, but these 6 women from across, the span of human history are hanging out as a group of poets. But then what happens is one of them, and it's Lilith, I believe, who writes a poem that has the taming of the shrew in it. And she's sort of grappling with this idea of the taming of the shrew and how do we read it as in contemporary Australia, in contemporary culture. How do we talk about the taming of the shrew, this play that's meant to be a comedy, which is really difficult to read now as a comedy, obviously. But it also has to do with, the fact that Lilith is sort of taking up Katarina's story and using it for her own purposes. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your decision to kind of take that metafictional leap, because it also sort of seeps into the way that Ursula and her sister begin to have a conversation about that. Can you tell us a bit about that?
That was just one of those aha moments that you have, when you're writing a book. So because I started off with the Brangwen sisters, they used footnotes from the novels. Or the novel, and I loved it. Like, it was a really fun thing to use because I got to incorporate a few lines from the book. And then when I added the other women in, I thought, well, what am I doing here? I think I'm supposed to be making a comment on giving women their female voice, and I'm using the male's words. So how does that work? So that's when that idea came, where I thought, actually, I think no one's going to do that, and then they're going to struggle with Ursula doing that, and then it's going to open up this whole idea of the patriarchy.
Yeah, really, really grapple with, like, when is my story my own story? Because they are certainly women who in many ways outlive their creators or exceed their creators. Like, I think in lots of ways, Lolita can step away from Nabokov. Dolores can step away from Nabokov. And certainly does in this as well. Like, she is her own person. She's a mother. She has her own life, and so does Lilith as well. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the verse novel, because that is the tradition that this book sits in. And writing verse novels has always been a sort of fraught act. Dorothy Porter's The Monkey's Mask, Les Murray's Freddie Neptune. There is a really strong tradition of very successful verse novels in Australian literature. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you want to write in this particular form, in this way?
I think I just have a bit of an obsession with letters. Not that I wrote a lot of letters or anything like that, but they're romantic. So with the Brangwen sisters, it was always going to be them backing and forthing with letters, because this was, I started writing this in 2004. So
did you?
Yeah. Wow. The poems are really, really old. It's the letters that are new.
So you'd written all the poems, And then you started writing the letters, because the way that the book is structured is that we sort of get letters or emails. There are emails,
Yeah,
really.
emails.
And then in between we get poems, and, you know, we get the sense that the characters meet and they have their monthly writing meeting in between some of these letters and poems that we see. So there's this sort of interesting lapse of time that's always occurring between, you know, what we're seeing and what's actually happening for them in their lives.
Yeah, so it did just start off as poetry. I don't remember when I brought in the letters, the emails, but, you know, again, that was years ago too. This was just one of those books that, you know, I just kept putting away, and I was actually okay that I wasn't doing anything with it. I really liked the concept, so I kept wanting to do something with it, but I just thought it was kind of crappy writing, you know, to be honest, and I just didn't really quite know what to do with it. So, but every time I picked it up, you know, I probably picked it up every 2 or 3 years, and then gave it a good solid 3-month go or something. Every time I picked it up, I liked it a little bit more, you know, and then I think it was when the fires were happening, that's when I went, well, I'm just gonna really go for it this time. And then I kind of loved it, actually. And then I went, I'll send it to recent work, because they do these classical sort of themed anthologies. And like I said, Penelope Leland was just really good with turning it into more of a, just asking me the right questions. And because I've written novels, it was my favorite part.
Mark of a good editor,
just,
right?
Yeah.
What questions to ask.
I just really loved, I loved the narrative.
Yeah.
At that point,
There's also threads in this book that kind of spoke to some of the things that I've seen in your, I guess, your editorial work. You know, I was thinking of Shaping the Fractured Self when I read some of the passages, because it's also a book that to me is also about the body and about trauma and the way in which all of these women are kind of carrying their pasts and grappling with how they're going to take them into the future. And I wondered maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, and if you have some poems perhaps from Lilith, who sort of to me spoke most to that idea in this book.
It's interesting. So you think that Lilith was embodying the trauma more than the others?
Oh, I would say Katerina probably was the most traumatized, in that she was sort of grappling with that. But I think Lilith was sort of, to me, embodying the idea of time and history and the way that the body carries the traumas of the past. You know, I kind of read her, I believe it's MS in the book, her diagnosis as a kind of way in which her body is sort of experiencing the ravages of history and the way in which she has been marginalized, right? You know, that she's set aside.
That's really interesting to me. You know, I've decided I'm never going to write a book ever without somebody who has some sort of chronic condition in it. And, you know, Lilith was a good one because she has everything. I feel like she has everything in the line. You know, she's got a really good career. She's confident with who she is. She speaks well, but her partner just died. So she's got, you know, this grief. Her partner is Eve, actually. And, you know, she's just died. And so she's got that going on. And, you know, when I decided to give somebody an illness, I kind of wanted to give it to her because I thought, well, illnesses don't stop for grief. You know, I didn't want that to be her only plot trajectory. So that's kind of why I gave her MS. But I like what you say. Yeah.
I wonder if it was also, sorry, that's my own wild interpretation.
That's great.
But I also saw it as, you know, kind of, you know, she's also a character who's racked by grief throughout the book. She's writing these kind of, you know, sonnets that are also very much elegies for Eve and for a kind of historical relationship, you know, a relationship that really carries throughout, you know, much of the way that we conceive of history in the West.
Yeah, she lets everybody know straight away. Let's see, this isn't one I highlighted, but yeah, she lets everybody know straight away. This is her first email. So Ursula sends out an email to everybody and says, you know, you guys don't know each other, but what do you think about doing this? Ursula's husband, Rupert, is sick as well, and she's caring for him, and she's just going, I just need women. I need women right now. So Lilith gets back and she says, dear all of us, this sounds good. I've been working on sonnet sequences for the last few months and liking the project, so I'll go from there. Be warned, they're more playful than what usually comes out of me, dare I say, puerile. So they feel rather minor right now. Of course, I'm of the mind to make them something major. As most of you probably know, I recently lost my partner, Eve. So beware that she isn't everything I write these days. Yes, I agree. Women need women. So yeah, I keep saying I had a good time writing these people because I've had a good time writing all of them.
Yeah.
But I did enjoy just writing lots and lots of love poems that were based in memory. That was just a really beautiful thing to do.
It is, yeah. And Cattie's poems sort of overlap with that as well, don't they? They kind of.
Yeah, she's more with her children now, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, she has that kind of, but I guess also that sense of nostalgia.
She does love her husband. He is difficult.
He's a tough and elusive individual, I get the sense. There's also a character, Mel in the book who kind of grapples with the idea of what poetry is for. And I don't really want to put you on the spot and say, what is poetry for, Heather? Which is a tough question to ask. But, what's Mel trying to do with her poetry in this book? She writes these very short, very brief, almost kind of concrete poems. What's poetry for Mel?
Well, she lets it loose that she just wants to write. She doesn't want to be published. She's not interested in that. She's, she does plays. She's a French girl. She goes to festivals and stuff. That's her thing. She likes to write. She just likes to write things she thinks that probably aren't very interesting to other people, but they're interesting to her. So, I enjoyed writing Mel because I did get to, one of the joys of this is I didn't have to worry too much about if the poems were good or not because it's a critiquing group. So with Mel, I really did get to write itty bitty tiny little poems and go, that's it, that's the poem. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to say anything huge, but some of her poems I feel like are the hugest ones, and at one point Lilith says, like, can we just please send one poem a month? I can't possibly read 2 poems by each of you. And even if you say, but Mel's are little, never underestimate a short poem. So I tried to never underestimate her short poem.
It's like a slight self-burn here, but when I read Lilith's comment, I was like, that's a classic academic question to say, I couldn't possibly read more than one poem. And then of course what she sends is a very long poem in multiple segments. So it's basically like a 2-pager, and Mel has sent literally 2 lines and she says, no, Mel, you simply cannot send more than one poem. So it's a great loophole that she invents there. But it's also, such a lovely and very human, I think, part of those kinds of organizational structures where you're trying to figure things out together. I have one more question for you about the title, because I think it's such a charming title. And I just wanted to let everybody know that after that, I'm going to open it up for the questions. So if you have some questions, if you're on Zoom and you have some questions, please pop them through in the chat. But tell us a little bit about the title, Rhymes with Hyenas. It's such a lovely title.
I love the title so much. So they were trying to work out a name for themselves, and they came up with all these different people, animals in the animal kingdom and that had matriarchal societies, and they, and Lilith was just slamming every one of them, going, well, we can't do that because this, and then somebody said, well, hyenas, this is why hyenas are really amazing. Female hyenas are really amazing, and so they're like, yep, hyenas, and someone said, oh, the laughing hyenas. They're like, nah, that's making fun of them, and somebody said rhymes with hyenas. And, this was probably a good 10 years into this book that I went, that's the title, Rhymes with Hyenas. And so I put it up on Facebook. I just went Rhymes with Hyenas, thinking I'm just going to be really cryptic and say, this is the name of my book, but I just put Rhymes with Hyenas. All these people got back to me and put all these names, all these little words that rhymed with hyenas. So then I went, that's so cool. So Mel and Dolores are actually friends before the group starts. So they've got quite a little bond separate from everybody else. And they just sort of randomly rip out a rhyme with hyenas throughout the book. And so that was that random thing that came with the rhymes that came, 3 years ago or something. So that was kind of the last invention.
Oh, wow.
and I loved it. Like I so much fun. You know?
Oh, I love how much, it seems like you've had a huge amount of fun writing this book, and it is a huge amount of fun to read as well. Does anybody have any questions for Heather about Rhymes with Hyenas or about poetry or writing in general?
Without having read the book, I apologize. The character of Lilith, her voice, and relating back to the origins of her story in like for the depth of space and time in the early history of humanity. Did you write her angry, impatient, frustrated, or like, because there's so many different ways to describe her, and as I understand now, a lot of mainstream Jewish philosophers are now talking about her as one of the first feminists.
Yes, yes.
And one like different people talking about her in the different ways we think now in the 21st century. And I'm really curious to hear your take on her.
Yeah. If it's okay, I'll just summarize it quickly for the people on Zoom. That was a question that was primarily about the different interpretations of Lilith throughout history, and that increasingly she's, perhaps being interpreted as a character who has a lot of anger and is an angry individual because of the way in which she's represented and treated. And did you kind of think about that as you were writing?
Yeah, Lilith is definitely the most angry of the women. And rightfully so. She was cast out of, Caddy was exiled too, but Lilith was cast out in a really, you don't belong in the human race, get away. Some other woman's going to take your place because you didn't lie beneath the man. So she is really angry, and I definitely did choose her to be sort of acerbic and a little bit, she was way more toxic, at the beginning. She was not very nice at all. Yeah, but she is grieving, so that sort of made me find my way into her beyond what her symbol, what she stood for in my head. But yeah, I absolutely think she's a great feminist icon, and I wanted to work on that. And I did read, probably 25 years ago, I read, and I probably should look this up, but I did read somebody had written a poetry book about Lilith and Eve and as lovers, and so I took that idea on. So that's not my idea. I need to look that up, don't I? Yeah. So but I never got that out of my head, and I just thought that's just brilliant. She takes Eve with her.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, this is gone. Okay. Does anyone else have a question? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Heather. It was absolutely beautiful. I was just really curious about some of the women that are not in the book that you had to cut in terms of historical figures. Was there one that you really wish you could have put in there that kind of hurt to let go of the most? Or
Yeah. So the question was about the women that I let go, and did any of it really hurt? And I was not sad to let Medea go. I just didn't understand her, like that's a pretty difficult one to understand. So she was okay. And I felt a huge amount of relief when I let her go, actually. She was probably dragging it down. Look, when I let the Ellen Jamesian go, that was really kind of hard for me, actually. I really enjoyed her poems that she wrote, and I enjoyed her personality so much. And because she had, I don't know if it, I think that went, okay. So those of you who don't know, in World According to Garp, there's this group of women called the Ellen Jamesian who have cut their tongues out, a bit in retaliation, or I guess in remembrance of a young girl named Ellen James, who was brutally raped, and the man cut her tongue out. So there's a whole group of women that Garp's mother looks after. They're obviously really damaged, and I really liked having an Ellen Jamesian in there because we don't get those women's backstories. We just know that they're Ellen Jamesians, and they're kind of almost funny, like they're made fun of.
Comedy, for sure.
But if they're willing to cut their tongues out for a child who's been raped, I imagine they have a lot of trauma in their life too. So I just got chills like saying that. So I was really quite sad to let her go, because I felt she needed to be there, but like I said, I just couldn't take on that trauma because I don't have that trauma, and it just felt really wrong. Yeah.
Do we have some questions from Zoom?
No, we don't yet. Anyone on Zoom can please?
Oh, that's good. I just saw the
No,
little
it was just
chat
the,
that people have read.
it's just saying to put your questions in here, but no one has.
Lovely. Does anybody else have any questions before we wrap up? Yeah.
I have a question. Sorry, it's not about this collection. I did read that maybe you were still working on some stuff on Van Gogh.
Oh.
Because I did read that other work of yours about Van Gogh, which is fascinating, and why you wrote it. And I was wondering where you're going with that.
Yeah, that's another one that I've been writing for many, many years.
Yes.
But
And it's fascinating.
it is again, it's a conceptual book like this one is. So I guess it's one of those books that I went, this is brilliant, I'm going to do this. And then I just went, I can't carry this off. So I keep putting it away. But so I have this thing called Meniere's disease, which is a inner ear disorder that can cause debilitating vertigo and just a noise. And so Van Gogh was misdiagnosed as having Meniere's disease. And when I found out about it, I went, oh, that's amazing because of his paintings and he cut his ear and, I must write about this. And then I found out, like I did the research, I went, he totally didn't have that at all. So I thought, well, I'm not going to get rid of that idea. I'm going to do something with it. So, I wrote letters to Van Gogh, and then I wrote this novella, and then I wrote some essays. And I thought, okay, so I'm writing something about where art and illness meet. Then I realized I had just been writing about illness, and I had been writing about art. So this year I picked it back up, and I picked it up in March, and I've just been reading about art all year. That's it, focus reading, art. So novels and essays and anything I can find on art, like lots of Ali Smith and Maggie Nelson and just these brilliant women who are writing about art. And I've just been writing essays on art with links to illness, but now I've taken the focus away from me and I'm focused on art. And it's telling Hattie last night when I saw her that I'm going to miss it when I'm done. I'm definitely going to miss it. And I'm hoping to get it, I'm hoping to get all of them written by January. I'm going to Varuna in February. I'm going to compile it all, which is really interesting because I started writing it in Varuna. And Varuna is a yellow house. And Van Gogh lived in a yellow house. So it's a really circular sort of project. But I'll, without a doubt, I'll miss this project more than anything I've written. Absolutely. It's been just beautiful, soaking up art.
Very
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, I have another question, not to monopolize the conversation, but I wonder, oh, thank you. I wonder, since you mentioned Varuna, some of the loveliest experiences that I've had in writing have been at Varuna, and it's so essential, especially because women tend to take on the primary domestic labor role in the household. Those spaces, why are those spaces so important for women? And do you see that as something that you want to continue to write about and continue to think about in your work?
I definitely remember the first time I stayed at Varuna. I have 3 kids. My youngest was only 3 or 4, and I just couldn't believe how much time I could gain back without cutting fruit all day long. Just fruit, it doesn't sound like a big thing, but it's like constant and it just takes you away from what you're doing as well. So that was a really big sort of moment in my life. And then when I left there, I went, well, that's that. I'm just gonna make time once a year to do, some focused writing away. And with the Meniere's, my acupuncturist, every time I came back, she started going, your heart, your heart rate, or what she listens to, your pulse. It's really, really solid. It's really good. And she said, you just need to go away as much as you can. And I just went, doctor's orders. Yeah. So, in fact, my husband and I, he's always wanted a beach house, and we just took a really long time sorting something out. And then we found this house that we want to move into when our kids leave. And so it's our holiday home, but it's going to be our real home, and turned it into a little tiny modest writer's retreat in South Australia. And it just makes me really happy because of that exact reason, to just have this focused time for people to get away. And even if it's 3 days, you know, I get so much done when I'm away. So yeah, like I think it was a real aha moment, definitely for me when I went to Kaurna. So I'd like other people to be able to recognize those moments when they come to our place.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's such a lovely thing to want to give to people, you know. And I think it definitely happens in this book as well. You know, they all take a trip.
Oh, yeah.
They take a trip away together, and you know, Caddy, of course, has to bring her child because her husband, I think, can't, you know, she says in her email he cannot feed Bruno by the bottle. So, you know, those sort of vestiges remain, but you know, it's clearly this really generative space for all of them to spend time together.
And they go to Burra, and that's where my husband and I were married. So it was a little bit of a call out to Dash.
I'm keen to hear what you think about the place of poetry in the world today, because it feels like really recently there's been a bit of a shift in terms of people consuming poetry and engaging with poetry. Have you seen that happen of late?
Well, I've certainly seen different voices being, you know, written in poetry, and I think that's the most exciting thing to me is, you know, being able to read. I just went on something last night. I shouldn't have done it. Clicked on this thing on Facebook, and it was about the first Black conductor to ever come to the Met in New York, and you know, isn't this wonderful? Isn't this great? And the comments were just, you know, it was just I should have turned it off immediately.
Shouldn't have read the comments.
It was really horrible.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that sort of thing is I feel like we're really opening up with poetry, especially. I mean, we're really opening up our minds to other people's stories. I see it in literature without a doubt, through novels as well, but I just think it's really blooming in poetry right now, particularly with women, which is great, but lots of amazing Indigenous writers. And, you know, I mean, Ellen Mirvan is just, you know, phenomenal. Her generosity in her writing is, I can't work it out, you know, and I just feel like when I read her work, she teaches me so much. So I feel like I have a lot to learn, and I do use poetry for that. I mean, and you know, men too, like David Stavenger's last book. Gosh, you know, he really dove into mental health issues, and I just learned a lot from him. Yeah, so you know, I'm speaking to the bubble, I'm sure. we're all happy to read poetry here, but it would be nice to think that it's getting out there further, so other people are learning these things too.
I really love that about the book as well, because I think that in lots of ways, you know, the women grapple with what it is to write poetry and what the function of poetry is. You know, they're constantly kind of going back and forth between different modes of poetry. You know, I'm going to read it in a kind of spoken word context like Dolores does. Are we going to write these really short, concrete poems, much like Mel does, these longer sonnet sequences that have the kind of the voice of the elegy sort of attached to them like Lilith does. And I think what it really shows us is that sort of generosity of spirit that is associated with I think, you know, reading contemporary poetry now. That you do get a huge range of different voices and different modes as well, you know, a willingness to accept that, which I can imagine is maybe not the case in writers' groups, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. You know, I was listening to a podcast about Adrienne Rich today, and the way in which she really kind of had to kind of move outside of the strictures that she was very used to in the 50s as a high achieving writer, and how it took her quite a bit of time to sort of find a group of writers that she really identified with, and that kind of changes her poetry. And that's how we get kind of poems like Diving into the Wreck, which really changed things. And I think that sort of made me think about this and the way that all of those poets change and grow over time. So congratulations once again. Are we, sorry, just
Yeah, I think unless there's a burning question from the audience, I think we can.
last opportunity, last call.
No.
Okay.
Well, I think we can move to the I won't use mine, that's okay. I think we can move to the signing and mingling part of the evening. It's been really fantastic to host you.
Oh, thank you.
Our
Thank you.
first
Both of you.
interstate author in months. My goodness.
So I have something really important to say.
Yeah.
Okay. I have something really important to say, and I can't believe I forgot to say it, but, you know, I should have started this by saying, I, you know, wrote this on Garland, and, you know, of course, it, you know, respecting the elders is so important. And this book, if you get it tonight, you're going to get a special edition because I really messed up in it. So I actually, I have this moment where this is so important. I say this to you guys, but I have this moment where Ursula is questioning the validity of some of our acknowledgements. And she says, I think us white people sometimes get it really wrong. She got it wrong. She said, welcome to country instead of acknowledgement of country. So I discovered it about 2 days before the book launch in Adelaide. And I contacted my publisher and I went, you know, this is classic. And I said, is there any way we can change it where, you know, maybe it can becomes a learning point? And I just thought, and he is going to change it. And I thought, this is my learning point. This was a really big mistake to me. And again, this is, you know, I guess an example where poetry can teach you something. And so, you know, just had to say that.
Let's give her a round of applause. Once again.
And thanks to Ella for doing such a great job, of course. So now's the time that we're going to go inside and do our signing. So thank you everyone for joining us on Zoom. I will leave the meeting now.